Hi, and welcome to Wealthy Living Radio Show. I'm Lisa, your host and founder of Wealthy Living. So through my services, I help people develop a true connection to themselves, to others, and to the world around them. So with this show, I'll be bringing on every fortnight a different guest, and I'll be having conversations with a variety of professionals to discuss topics that cover all areas of wellness, so including the physical, the environmental, the emotional, the spiritual, and even the financial, just everything that relates to a person and their life. I'll discuss how our choices impact our life, so impact our work, our relationships, our health, and then together we'll suggest ways that you can and things that you can action in your own life to live a wealthier life. So during today's episode, we're going to talk about food, and food is something that we all have within our life. We all relate to it differently, and I want to discuss a little bit more in this episode about our relation to food and about the way that it impacts our relationship to us and our connection to ourself and to others and to nature. So to do this, I couldn't think of a better guest to bring on today than award-winning food writer, restaurant critic, and author of 3 thermomix cookbooks, and someone who has their own cooking video show, and that is Dani Valent. So Dani, welcome to the Wealthy Living Radio Show, and thanks for joining me today to discuss food. I know this is a much loved topic of yours, so welcome. Oh, it's a pleasure. So what I wanted to do to start off the conversation today, Dani, is talk a little bit about what we're currently seeing with food, and whether it be on the internet or in print media or on the TV or just what people are talking about compared to maybe some of the other things which you do within your realm of food. So what I'm talking about is that when I see, all the information that's out there, it seems to talk a lot about food for its nutritional value. So how does it impact our energy levels? Even talks about restrictions and diets and how food impacts our weight and our heart health and all of these things to do with the nutrient side of food. Now, I think that all of that is super, super important. I come from a health promotion background, so I've given a number of health consultations and nutrition consultations at companies, and I've given talks to do with food and food labels and food for energy, etc., etc. So there's no doubt that that kind of we are what we eat, and that the nutritional value for food is really, really important. But I'm just wondering, and I'd like to sort of get your take on it, of how much we've maybe tipped the balance over, and perhaps we're with so much information on the nutritional side of food from so many different people that people are maybe a little bit more confused, and maybe it brings about more stress with all of this overload, all this information overload. And are we missing part of the conversation that talks about food and culture and community and how our soul is connected to food and how then it affects our relationships and, and all of that, all of the stuff to do with that. I mean, there's so much even information out there these days on how community and sharing and well-being reduces our stress and therefore, brings about greater longevity. So I just want to have a little bit more conversation about that and hear what your take is on food for nourishment versus food for nurturing. So the nourish versus nurture. So I'd love to hear what you've got to say about that, Dani.
I do think the balance has perhaps swung a little bit too far to the information and to the to the science of nutrition and perhaps less to the heart and the art of nourishment. And for me, that is a lot about, the traditions that have built up around food, the traditions that are around eating together, the festivals that are around food, and creating those bonds between people, between families, between groups and in society that really nourish us and keep us connected and strong. So I don't at all discount the importance of nutrition, but I think, we hark back in some of these cases to, I think there's a little bit of a discrepancy in the way we think about cultures past. On the one hand, we're looking at the Okinawans and their, the fact that they're one of the longest lived people around. So we eat the Okinawans' nourish bowl, for example. But on the other hand, we want to know all the science behind it. Now, the Okinawans probably have never thought about, the amino acids or the phytonutrients or whatever it is, the antioxidants. They're just eating, enjoying. It's part of their culture. It's part of their history, and they happen to be living for a long time. I think a lot of it's great to be intentional about what we're eating, but I think we can overdo it. And I think the pleasure of sitting down with a nice big bowl of something that's been cooking in the oven or burbling on the stove, sharing it, perhaps, that whole idea of breaking bread together. Bread, so many people these days see almost as a bad food. But historically, for thousands of years, it's been a food that people have enjoyed together. So I don't know. I think there is definitely a case for stripping away some of the anxiety and just enjoying the pleasures of being around the table with family and friends.
Yeah, I tend to really agree with that, and I think that that's definitely something that we've lost a lot of, especially with the fast-paced world, and you don't have as many, say, mums whose role it is to be that housemaker, and they're doing work and they're doing the house duties and all these different things. So it is about that, just getting food in. It's dinner time and just like, let's get some food into our children. Let's, I might eat with them or I might eat later. And it does lose that whole sort of family connection, which I remember when I was a kid. I don't think that there were many nights at all that we didn't sit down as a family. I even think that half of my knowledge and so much of my wisdom probably comes from those dinner table conversations.
Yeah, look, I think what you're saying is really true, and I also think that when we start having those kinds of conversations, that can so easily lead to guilt and people feeling, and that, I can't make that happen because we've got soccer practice and, my partner's home late, or I just can't, I'm too tired to get them to turn off the TV and come to the table, whatever it is. And I feel like, the guilt that can flow from ideas about what we should or should not be doing is also damaging and can also be exhausting, and it can also make people throw up their hands in despair. So I think it's not that we all need to go back to some sort of golden age where things were better and things were different. Like we're living now. We're living the lives that we're living now, and I don't think we need to feel bad about that. But I just think we can look at ways that we can strip away some of the anxieties and certainly the guilt about the way that we feed ourselves.
Yeah. So that's so true because, there's so much mum guilt out there already. To add that in is really hard. But I suppose it just comes back to that balance again and looking at, when we're tipping it over and when we're not. But, just picking up like that part you just said about the guilt of what we're actually eating. I'd like to talk a little bit more about that because I think that, food really evokes a lot of emotions, and they can be positive emotions and all this nostalgia and childhood memories and all these things which are really beautiful in us. And it can also, for a lot of people, evoke a whole lot of negative emotions, and they can have this love-hate relationship with food. And I'm just wondering if maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the ripple effects of these negative implications, like what what sort of things comes up for people around around these food choices, and why is this all this anxiety? And I mean, there's the obvious one about, women often, or even men, wanting to have a certain body image, and then, there's, I mean, eating disorders have been going on for a long time, and they seem to be getting worse and worse, and it may be the media or just external pressure, but why do you feel that there is so much pressure and anxiety around people's food choices today?
Yeah, there's this awesome study where the researchers asked French people and American people what they associated chocolate cake with, right? So they said chocolate cake to some French people and to some Americans.
Yep.
And the words that the French people came back with were, I associate chocolate cake with celebration, with party, with birthday, with delicious. And the Americans came back with guilt.
Oh, wow.
Bad food. And it's so interesting the way that foods get these reputations, and they can be so different among different groups of people. So look, I think it's a lot of it stems from this idea of food that's good and food that's bad, and we're often hearing about the food that's evil this year or this decade, and this food is the superfood of the year. And I'm very suspicious of any food that people. Well, I'm suspicious of those labels around food, and I'd rather perhaps go back to what you were saying in the beginning about that there's food that energizes and that nourishes us. But I honestly don't really think that there's any food that's bad for us. There's just food that's bad for us if we have it too much, and I don't think. I even dislike the idea of the guilty pleasure. I just think we should allow ourselves the pleasure. So if the pleasure is sitting down and eating that chocolate cake, just let yourself enjoy it. Don't enjoy the naughtiness, just enjoy it. I think, when you think about the way that the French eat, and there is this idea of the French paradox, how do they drink all that red wine and eat all that cheese and eat all those baguettes and still stay so slim and so glamorous? I think the idea of it being a paradox is probably something we need to pick apart a little bit, where it's not so much about what they're eating, it's perhaps more about how they're eating it. So they're probably not going back for seconds and thirds. They're eating it in long leisurely meals that are as much about the conversation as what they're enjoying at the table. And yeah, it's about mixing up those foods with salads, or with a lot of walking around and perhaps getting on their bikes or whatever it is. So again, it is that idea of balance.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that another thing that's really interesting that we talked about off air the other day, which would be good to have a little chat about, is the idea of the possibility of control, and how maybe people, with the world being so uncertain and so many things in someone's life just being unknown and feeling out of control, and is food then become one of those things that they can control? So yeah, I'd like to just hear a little bit more about how you feel about that.
Yeah, I think that's something I definitely feel that there is so much in our life and in our world that does seem pretty crazy and very fast and hard to grasp and tricky to wrangle, and you sort of don't know what's going to happen next. And food is something that you can, to a large degree, control, and that's because it's so abundant in our world. We're so fortunate, and that's sort of super abundance, that choice can be crippling as well, but it is also something that you can, I suppose, decide how you're going to eat and control that quite fiercely, and have very fixed beliefs about the food that's good and the food that's bad, or the food that works for you and the food that doesn't. And, of course, that a lot of people definitely, have feelings like, oh, if I eat that, I don't feel well. If I eat this, I feel better. And I just think, well, that's fine, absolutely. But I do think that sometimes when we do have very fixed ideas about what we should eat, that can also lead to isolating ourselves